There are four types of non-specific defenses. The first one are what we call barriers. So as the name implies, a barrier separates the external environment from the internal environment. Or another way of saying it is that you could say that barriers help protect the internal environment from the external environment. The first type of barrier is the skin. And in this illustration here, this represents the skin. These structures here represent pathogens. And as long as the skin remains intact, these pathogens can't get in. The next type of barrier are what we call mucous membranes. In this diagram here, mucous membranes that I've decided to show you are the mucous membranes found within this nasal cavity. So this here is the nasal cavity. And these mucous membranes secrete a substance called mucus. Now, mucus is sticky and it's going to trap dirt and debris. Along with mucous membranes in the nasal cavity, you'll find another type of barrier mechanism, and we call this hair. Right? So you would see little hairs in this area here. The next type of non-specific defense are called chemical mediators. These are chemicals that begin a non-specific defense. There are four types of chemical mediators. The first one are called enzymes. An example of an enzyme are found in tears. And this enzyme is called lysozyme. Right? So this is an enzyme found within tears that helps keep tears clean, helps kill pathogens that may enter through the membranes surrounding the eye. The second type of chemical mediator are what we call cell secretions. Right? So these are substances that are being released by the cell. The example of a cell secretion is called histamine, which we'll talk about in depth in a future lecture. But in this diagram here, right, this is histamine. And histamine is released by this cell right here called a mast cell. The third type of chemical mediator are what we call complement proteins. There are a variety of complement proteins. Some complement proteins initiate the inflammatory response, and some complement proteins create holes or pores in cell membranes. So in this illustration here, these represent complement proteins. And you can see that these complement proteins create a pore. And in this diagram here, you can see fluids rush in to the cell, causing the cell to lyse or burst. The fourth type of chemical mediator is interferon. Interferon is a substance released by dying or infected cells. And this chemical signals other cells of the infection. So in this diagram, we have a pathogen that is infecting a cell, and this cell in turn makes interferon. And that interferon, right, travels to other cells causing these cells to put up a defense against the pathogen. The third type of nonspecific defense involve white blood cells. White blood cells play a major role in immunity. And in nonspecific immunity, there are three types of white blood cells. The first one are called phagocytic cells, such as a phagocyte and a macrophage. PHAG means to eat. CYTE, cyte, means cell. So this is a cell that eats. Macro means large, phage means to eat, so a macrophage is a large white blood cell that eats. So in this illustration here, this comical illustration, this represents a phagocytic cell, right? And this poor little guy here represents some sort of a pathogen being eaten. The next type of white blood cell are cells that are involved with inflammation. And the white blood cell that we're going to talk about is a mast cell. A mast cell is a cell that secretes a substance called histamine. Again, we'll discuss this in a future lecture. So in this particular illustration, this will represent a mast cell. And these little white structures here represent histamine. The last type of white blood cell that we're going to discuss are what we call natural killer cells. Natural killer cells specifically target dying cells or cells that have been infected. Natural killer cells will also target cancer cells and tumors. Right? Now, the way a natural killer cell kills is by releasing a substance that acts upon the cell membranes of a dying or infected cell, creating a pore in that cell membrane. And once that pore is created, water rushes in and the cell bursts. So in the illustration, this structure here is a natural killer cell. This up here is an infected cell. So a natural killer cell, once it's attracted to an infected cell, releases substances will act upon the cell membrane of this infected cell, causing the infected cell to burst. The fourth type of nonspecific defense mechanism is a fever. And a fever is elevated body temperature. And elevated body temperature means that there's heat. And heat destroys cells. The last type of nonspecific defense is the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is characterized by the symptoms of swelling, redness, heat, and pain. Swelling, redness, and heat are caused by the amount of blood that has now entered the damaged area. For the inflammatory response to begin, cells have to be damaged. In this particular case, there was a break in the barrier. Pathogens on the surface of the skin are able to enter through this break in the barrier. Damaged cells release chemicals that attract other cells to the damaged area. One particular cell that is attracted are these cells called mast cells. Mast cells release a substance called histamine. Histamine is what we call a vasodilator. And a vasodilator increases the permeability of the blood vessel, right? And it also increases the diameter of the blood vessel. By increasing the diameter of the blood vessel, more blood is able to enter the area. By increasing the permeability of the blood vessel, substances found within the blood vessel are able to leak out of that blood vessel. For example, complement proteins, white blood cells, platelets, antibodies, and nutrients. Red blood cells don't leak out of the blood cell, but red blood cells carry oxygen, and oxygen is going to play an important role in the repair of tissues since oxygen is needed for cellular respiration and the production of energy. So as each substance leaks out of the blood capillary, each one takes on their own responsibilities or roles in the inflammatory response. Complement proteins will begin to fuse to membranes of the pathogens, creating pores, killing the pathogens. And white blood cells and antibodies will begin either engulfing pathogens if it's a phagocytic cell, or antibodies bind to pathogens, rendering the pathogens useless. Platelets, when they leak out, will surround the damaged area and create a scaffolding within this damaged area. Nutrients will be used to help create new cells. And red blood cells will contain the oxygen needed for cellular respiration so that cells can produce energy in the form of ATP, and that energy will be used to rebuild new tissue.